On this episode of Women Connected, I'm talking with Julie Burwald, science writer and book author, about the tools she uses to conduct research around the globe without ever leaving her office.
This is the Women Connected podcast, where we believe that women can improve their personal and professional lives through technology. If you're ready to cut through the noise and learn exactly the tools you need to create your professional brand, be recognized, and keep up in today's fast-paced world, then stay tuned.
Welcome to the Women Connected podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Goodgame, Program Director at TBW, where we believe that women can improve their personal and professional lives through technology. Don't forget to check our website for the show notes for all of our podcast episodes. Just go to tbwconnect.com/listen. If you're enjoying this podcast series, please take a moment and rate and review the podcast on iTunes. We appreciate your support. If you want more great content from TBW, you can like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter. But even better, you can join TBW for just $52 a year and get access to members-only resources and events. Visit tbwconnect.com/join for more information. Today I'm talking with Julie Burwald, a freelance science writer based in Austin, Texas. Julie began her study of oceanic sciences in college and started her work in the field by scrubbing lab equipment at the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. Her studies took her to California, where she spent months at a time on research cruises in the Pacific. For the last 12 years, Julie has been a freelance science writer, contributing to textbooks, publications for the Bureau of Economic Geology at the University of Texas, and publications such as National Geographic. Most recently, she's completed her first book, Spineless, for which she conducted research all over the globe. Julie, welcome to the podcast.
I'm really happy to be here.
So today we are going to be talking about a couple of things related to your work as a science writer. And I just wanted to start off by asking, what does your job look like on a daily basis since you're a freelancer?
Well, day to day is different every day because I never know exactly where my jobs are coming from. I do a bunch of different kinds of science writing. I do work for textbook companies. And so if I'm on a project with a textbook job, I pretty much sit down at my computer and just write. If I'm writing a story on new research or kind of a more popular media source, then a lot of times I'll prep for interviews by reading a bunch of journal articles and look into, what the sort of known science is. And then I'll do a lot of interviews with the scientists who've done the work. And that's actually one of my favorite parts of the job. And then sometimes I'm pitching articles, which means I'm scouring the literature for new and interesting work that I think mainstream people will want to hear about. And I also have a job where I work up at UT with a group that does carbon sequestration in the Bureau of Economic Geology. And so I will go up to UT sometimes and work with them. So I'm all over the place.
Tell me a little bit about how you got your start as a science writer. The work that you're doing today is freelance, but I know that before you became a freelance writer, of course, you did a doctorate and a postdoctorate. And I'm just wondering what your career looked like before you started doing the freelance work.
Well, yeah, I got my PhD was in ocean science, and I did that in California. And then, as sometimes happens, you make these moves for love, and you end up landlocked when you used to study the ocean. And I moved my postdoc with me to the University of Texas, but I was working with a lot of people who were doing terrestrial work, and I just felt very lonely, and I wasn't doing very good research, and I knew that. And so I was sort of hunting around for something, and it came during a yoga class of all places, where a friend of mine told me that a multimedia textbook company in Austin was looking to hire physics writers. And my PhD was vaguely physics, so I went and interviewed for the job, and I got it. And it actually was an amazing experience for me because the requirements of these online textbooks meant that I had to be really economical with my words. And during that time, I learned in a way I never had before the value of words and what a cool puzzle it was to try to figure out how to say things in the best possible way. And I got really interested in science writing. And then the birth of my son coincided with sort of the bubble bursting on the tech market. And there were huge layoffs, and all the friends I'd been working with went to work at other publishing houses. And it was really easy for me to become freelance because I had lots of friends in lots of places. And so I've kept it up. I've just been freelancing for about the last 12 years.
Recently, though, your work has changed a little bit. And a few years ago, you began researching your book, Spineless, about jellyfish and about the way that the health of jellyfish in our oceans is somewhat representative of the health of our planet. Do I have that correct?
Well, it's almost inverse in that the health of the jellyfish is really good because of the things we're doing to the ocean.
So I had it backwards.
Yeah. They're a little bit of the cockroach of the sea. The jellyfish abundances, at least coastally, look to be on the rise. And I stumbled across the idea for it when I was, you're right, my writing started to change a couple of years ago when I got the opportunity to write for National Geographic a little bit. And one of the things that they asked me to do was to write the captions for a story about ocean acidification. And it always goes back to carbon dioxide, but because we're putting extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, when carbon dioxide mixes with water, it forms a weak acid called carbonic acid. And so the ocean is getting slightly more acidic, and that affects different organisms in different ways. And so National Geographic had made this graphic of winners and losers in a future acidified ocean, and they put jellyfish on the winner's side. And I was fact checking it for them, and I thought, really? Is that for sure? And I went and started digging into the scientific literature to try to back it up. And it's probably likely that jellyfish will be okay or more okay than other organisms in a future acidified ocean, except for there's not a lot of data, so we're not totally sure. But anyway, I got really interested in this question, and I started looking into the jellyfish literature, and what I found were it wasn't just the acidification question that was up for grabs. Almost everything about what we knew about jellyfish was being hotly debated among the scientists. And people started debating whether their numbers were increasing. Really, there was an aggressive debate about that going on. And I got sucked into it, and I realized I wanted to know more. So I kind of hijacked a spring break that our family had coming up, and I made us go to Gulf Shores, Alabama, where there's a pretty big lab that works on lots of different jellyfish problems. And when I was there, I met a geneticist who told me that the numbers of known jellyfish in the ocean are probably only a half or even a quarter of what's really out there, because we have such a poor understanding of jellyfish. And if we don't know even what species are there, it's even harder to understand their ecology. And as we make a lot of changes to the ocean right now, we're doing lots of things that affect jellyfish. We're overfishing the ocean. Probably about 90% of the fish that used to be there 100 or 200 years ago are no longer there. So jellyfish predators and competitors are gone. We've warmed up the ocean. So some species of jellyfish, especially those that tend to be spread broadly, reproduce faster in warmer waters. And coastal development is a large issue because jellyfish aren't just the medusa that we're familiar with. They also have a polyp stage, and that's how the medusa are formed. Each polyp, which glues itself onto the other underside of a structure, can form, in some cases, maybe 100 medusa.
Oh, wow.
So in nature, there aren't that many undersides. There's like the bottoms of rocks that are tipped up, or maybe like a clamshell that's kind of upside down, or a cave. But we've built so many docks and moorings and oil rigs that there's many undersides that didn't used to exist. And so there's speculation that that's part of what's causing jellyfish numbers to increase, at least rather significantly, at least in coastal regions.
Okay, so you found yourself on a family vacation in Alabama, starting to explore this jellyfish question.
Right.
And since then, I know that your research has taken you literally all over the world. But if I'm not mistaken, you have very rarely left your office in Austin, Texas, in order to do that research, right?
Well, I've left it some. I've traveled way more than I've physically traveled, for sure. But I've taken a bunch of trips because I do think even with, the ability to talk to people long distances using things like Skype, which is where we're getting to, I still think that when you see people in person, you have a better conversation. And so I've traveled to California and to Woods Hole, Massachusetts, which is sort of a hot spot for ocean science research in general, and up to Oregon and to Japan. And I've kind of hunted down these jellyfish scientists, but I've spoken to people much farther away than that. And that's because of the use of Skype.
So Skype was really the thing that when you and I were planning this conversation, Skype was the thing that we both latched on to as something that has made the work that you do as an independent researcher really possible, to talk to researchers who are all over the globe studying the same thing that you're interested in, but who, of course, are far out of reach. And just for our listeners, as we talked about that, I think we were both realizing how much video conferencing and teleconferencing has become a part of our average way of doing business these days, almost regardless of what field you're in. And so I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about how Skype has become such a significant tool for you in the process of connecting with these people around the world.
Yeah. So when I first started getting little jobs for National Geographic, I initially called people. They initially would give me like a research paper, and say, let's write a little piece on this. And so I called people on the phone and talked to them the way I sort of had. But the very first time I had to find my own sources, the editor had given me a topic, and the topic was these ancient bull-like creatures that only existed in Europe called aurochs. And he told me that he'd heard about this effort to try to recreate them, to take existing species of cow-like creatures and match up the DNA that was left in them from the aurochs and try to like backbreed an auroch for in today's world. And that was all I knew. And so I was like, oh my gosh, how do I do this? And I had to find my own sources. And a friend of mine said, well, just write an email and say you're working for National Geographic, and people will respond to you. And I was really nervous about it, but I did it. And a lot of this work is going on in Europe. And so I wrote all these emails to people whose names I just found online. And they all wrote back. In the morning, I woke up and my inbox was full of all these people who wanted to talk to me. And then I thought, how am I going to have all these interviews and make them make sense? So that was the first time I used Skype. And I found there was a tool called like Skype Recorder that I bought for $14. And so I thought I'll record all these interviews. And that was the very first time that I did use this Skype call. And I talked to people all over Eastern Europe. And it was like having this sort of crutch that I could record these Skype calls. And those were only audio calls. So it didn't get to your question about video calls. But as I've gone on and I've interviewed more and more people, I do like to have the video calls. And it's a funny thing, but I think it's a much more intimate thing when you can see people's faces and their expressions. And a lot of the scientists I talk to me from their home offices. And so, they're their wife or their husband will kind of stroll through in the background and I'll say, hi, and they'll kind of turn and introduce me to their spouse, or their kid will shoot through and they'll be like, I'm sorry. And I'll say, oh no. And because it makes the conversation much more human to have, you're almost being brought into someone else's house and they could be halfway across the world. Even seeing, the kind of bookshelves that people have behind them or the posters they have on the wall, it makes me less nervous as an interviewer. And I think it drives a connection that makes things much more comfortable. And, I find it the kind of tool I never expected to find. And then the fact that I can record everything also, means I can go back and make sure I've gotten quotes right and contexts right. So Skype really has opened up a whole world to me in terms of connecting with other people.
So I like the story that you're telling there about people's spouses or kids or pets kind of running through the video. I have a couple of friends who are regular teleconferencers. They deliver a lot of webinars or trainings through teleconferencing, often on Skype. And they always seem to post whether or not they're wearing pajama bottoms on the days that they have a video conference. And that, I have to say, is one of the things that makes me happy, I guess, that I do the podcast interviews, not as a video call. Not that you could see if I were wearing pajama bottoms. I am wearing real pants. Everyone will be happy to know. But, that's a fact of the working life that 10 years ago literally would not have existed. You never would have wondered if the person looking at you through your computer screen could tell if you were wearing pajama bottoms today.
And I mean, not to be, but, and I definitely have set up my office. It's half my kids' playroom, but right behind me where my camera focuses, there's a really cool picture of like turtles from a turtle preserve on the wall behind me, because I want people to think that that I'm really in an office.
Right.
I am. It just happens to also be my kids' playroom.
It's all strategic placement.
It's all strategic.
Right. So when we were talking about how you use Skype, there was another tool that you mentioned using with Skype that allows you to take notes while you're in conversation, and then you can go back to places, but I don't remember what it was called. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I love this software. It's called PairNote, and I think it's only available for the Macintosh. But what it is I can have a Skype call. I don't get video off of it, but I do get audio. And I can have it has a recording side, and then it also has a text side. And I can be typing notes and recording my audio. And I can also have questions already typed out if I want to have those, so that speeds me up, because I can just put my cursor underneath each question as I ask it. And what it does is it aligns your keystrokes with the audio. So if you want to go back and find a certain part of the interview, you just put your cursor in the text and it'll go to that part of the audio, and then you can listen around it if you're looking for a particular quote or if you want to remember how the conversation went. And it's an amazing software. It works on the iPad and also on the computer.
And was that free, or did that have a charge?
It's like a $9.99 kind of thing. It's really reasonable. And I use it constantly.
So
you can also import, if you're at a meeting, you can import slides. If someone gives you their PowerPoint presentation, you can import the PowerPoint and then take notes as they're talking and get their audio with the video, with the slides, and you're typing. So it's really cool.
So Skype has come such a long way. I was doing a little bit of research on it, and it was actually released in 2003. So it's 10 years old this year. And even today, when I talk with people about Skype, they really think of it only as not everyone, obviously, but many people think of it only as a resource for keeping in touch with their children or grandchildren. if they live in other cities or even in other countries. And just a couple of weeks ago, I was introduced to the function in Skype where you can actually share your desktop from your computer. My sister was showing me how to use a program that's new to me. And she was in Houston, I was in Austin, and she shared her desktop with me. And it was like having a live demo. I mean, it really was a live demo of this software program. And I think that software like PairNote added to Skype, and then something like what we're recording in right now, GarageBand, but then Skype Recorder, as you were mentioning, can really mimic the functionality of some of the more expensive and more impressive, I guess we could say, video conferencing software that's out there. But you can really put it together yourself for very minimal cost.
Yeah, I wonder about that. And I haven't had access to some of those more expensive video conferencing softwares, but I think you're totally right. And it makes, I really agree. I think you can do whatever you want to do, kind of cobbling things together, but it's pretty easy. Things work together really well.
Except when they don't.
Except when they don't. And there's one tool that I really, 10 years from now, I hope they have, which is a transcription software, because I've looked into that and, it doesn't exist yet in the form that would really help me, which would be to sort of have, we could have this conversation and then I could just run the audio through something and it would give me a printout of it. There's software that you can use that will learn your own voice so that you can do dictation. But if you're interviewing people with accents or, different pitches and different voices, it doesn't exist yet. So when I was thinking about this interview and I was thinking about what else would I really want in this technology, that would be my dream.
Several years ago, I worked for a nonprofit organization that had a large database of interviews given by people who spoke English, who were largely English speakers, but almost all of them were not native English speakers. And there was a National Science Foundation funded grant to do exactly what you're talking about, to learn speech recognition from people who were speaking the same language, but with either strong accents or different grammatical patterns, because maybe they weren't learned speakers of English. And I think that is something that's way far off in the future.
Yeah, it might be.
But it would be awesome.
Yeah, things go fast.
Okay, so now thinking back 10 years ago before Skype, could you have done the work that you've done for National Geographic and on Spineless, or would it have been almost out of reach for you?
I think it's a really good question, and it wouldn't have been impossible. I would have been less comfortable with it, I think. It eased it for me a lot. But you could pick up a phone 10 years ago and you could get in touch with people. And you could have conversations. So it's not that it would have been impossible. It's just that it's so much easier. And I think I became a better interviewer a lot faster. Maybe it's just me and my style. I've never been very good at picking up the phone and calling people, but I sort of love getting on Skype. And I'm not sure, I think it's this visual thing that, just makes it easier for me. But it's not that it would have been totally impossible. So I don't think we can go that far.
Okay. So what's the most difficult interview that you've had via Skype? And was it because of content or because of technical difficulties?
Well, I will say I've never had a technical difficulty with Skype. So it's not that. And I think the hardest interviews are with people who don't really want to talk to you. Mm-hmm. And that's a content issue. sometimes people just don't want to give you very much. And even if you can look them in the eye and say, hey, I'm asking you this really interesting question. If it's not there, it's not there. The worst thing that's happened to me the worst thing about Skype for me is that I have to hear myself talk when I listen back to my interviews. And just like I did just now, I realized I have this tick of this deferential giggle that I just can't stand. And I try really hard not to do that in interviews. But having this playback mechanism has taught me my own foibles, I guess. And that's one of the things I hate the most about Skype. But in general, I think the technical difficulties are really nil, and the content problems would be content problems in any circumstance.
So you were saying that you think that having the video interviews or doing the video interviews made you a better interviewer more quickly. What tips might you have for people who are embarking on having to start doing teleconferencing or Skype interviewing to make sure that their interviews flow well and that things move easily?
And I'm not sure I'm an expert at this, but some of the things I found are to be really prepared, to have a list of questions, but to not stick to your list of questions if the conversation goes in a different direction. And also, the PairNote has helped me immensely because I don't have to scribble so fast to get down quotes. I can just write little notes, and that allows me to really listen to what the person's saying and ask follow-up questions. And sometimes those are the best things. I also like to ask people questions that are really open-ended sometimes, because they may have something to say that I was never thinking of because I'm not the expert. And I also like to ask people to give me their pie in the sky hopes in this area. Like, what could you solve if someone gave you the ability to solve it? So kind of ask those big forest kind of questions as opposed to always asking what's in the trees. People don't get the opportunity to talk that way often, or at least scientists, maybe. I'm being a little particular here.
So here's kind of a big sky, big forest kind of question. Sometimes on this podcast, we talk about defining technology. And we also talk about technology and its impact in our fast-paced world. So I'm going to try to put those two things together and ask you, when you think about technology, how do you really define it? And how do you think it's impacted by the fact that we do try to live such fast-paced lives?
So, yeah, I asked my son this last night when I was thinking about this interview, and he came up with what I think is a really good definition, which is an invention that enhances your life. And so I started thinking about that, and I think that we maybe don't always know what enhances our life. Like, we sometimes think we do, but we don't. And so it made me think about this paper that I read that was written by a scientist named Steve Haddock. And Steve wrote a paper called The Golden Age of Gelato, which is about jellyfish. And he looked back historically at jellyfish. And there's a kind of jellyfish called a comb jelly. On the East Coast, they call them gooseberries, I think, or sea grapes sometimes. And what he did was he looked through history and he said, how many of these comb jellies have been defined? It's every decade, starting in the 1700s. And pretty much in the late 1700s, early 1800s, between 5 and 10 of these creatures would be defined every decade. And then all of a sudden in 1900 to 1910, the number of these kind of jellies, they maybe defined 4 or 5 times as many. And so it seemed like there was this sort of renaissance, like people were really looking at the ocean, they were trying to understand it. And probably a lot of this was brought on by Darwin, because his work in the late 1800s was really taking hold, and people were like, how did we get here? And they were looking into the ocean where there's some of the most primitive animals to answer that question. But then the number of papers defining these comb jellies came crashing down again, like 1920, 1930, 1940. Again, only 5 to 10 per decade were defined. And the question is why? Because there's many, many more left to be defined. We know that we don't know these organisms. So what happened? What happened was the Industrial Revolution gave us motors and cranes and winches and oil to drive these things. And so we made these technological advances where we started driving big boats throughout the oceans and dragging nets behind them and learning all this stuff about the ocean because it became mechanized. But in the process, we stopped learning anything about jellyfish because they get destroyed by nets. And we just were moving way too fast to see these jellyfish. And now here we are, and their numbers are starting to increase, and we don't know very much about them. Throughout the whole last century, we kind of went back to the 1800s in the speed that we in learning about them. And it's because we were moving too fast for them. And so sometimes I think technology makes us move so fast that we don't get to learn as much because we're speeding right past it. And I think Skype for me has been a way to sort of slow down and have interviews that last a longer time. I'm never worried about how much Skype interviews cost. I'm always able to kind of relax and look at the person in the eye and ask about the things I see in the room around them. And it's a technology that's relaxed me, I guess. And so I think technology has an interesting way of like generally speeding us up. But for me, Skype is one that has slowed me down. And I found that to be a real benefit.
Well, I think that that's a great topic to sort of transition to the end of our interview here, since we're just about out of time. This idea of adopting a piece of technology because we think it's going to make our work more efficient or our processes go more quickly, when in fact it actually turns out to be something that allows us to savor the work that we have done and really spend more time with it, learning from the conversations that we have with others. You actually are able to spend more time with the people that you've interviewed than the time you just spent on the phone call.
It's true. I think it's a nice way to think about technology, or maybe just a different way to think about it. It's useful. It's been useful for me.
So Julie, thanks so much for talking with me today. I really enjoyed hearing about your research and how you are navigating this sort of new phase of your career as a writer, really embracing technology to help you get from point A to point B.
I've enjoyed it so much. It's really fun. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
The Women Connected podcast was brought to you by TBW and the TBPW Foundation, underwriter of many of our training and leadership development programs. For more information about TBW membership and our upcoming programs, please visit our website at tbwconnect.com. We hope you'll join us next time on Women Connected.